Your stories are best told by those who were on the other side of the barrel, because they know. They felt it. And they're the ones they attested. If we are required to do so, we will do it again. And I will go with you.
Well, the military chief of the South African National Defence Forces, General Ruzani Mapwanya, has come out to say that should the SADC members yet again require the services of the South African National Defence Forces, or should the DRC government require the services of the South African National Defence Forces, they will go back to Eastern DRC without hesitation to assist the FARDC to fight the M23. He went further to say that the M23 admitted that they felt the heat from the South African National Defence Forces earlier in the year when there was that fierce fight in the Battle of Goma. Well, that is the story that I'm going to tell you in this video. What exactly the military chief of the South African National Defence Forces say to his troops as they are withdrawing from Sake and Goma, as well as the allegations that the South African National Defence Forces, part of SAMI DRC, did not have enough equipment and food for them to last in these last periods while they were in Eastern DRC. Well, this is Bonafide. If you haven't subscribed, kindly subscribe and hit that notification button so that when I release something new on the Eastern DRC crisis, you get notified as soon as possible. The military general of the South African National Defence Forces has said that the M23 attested that they felt the heat of the South African National Defence Forces in the fields while they engaged in a fierce war earlier this year in what is now infamously known as the Battle of Goma. We are talking about this battle where 14 of the South African National Defence Forces troops lost their lives, and perhaps this was the turning point of the SADC members for them not to continue with the mission in Eastern DRC, as many have known since. But as it turns out, the South African National Defence chief has said that their withdrawal from Eastern DRC is not because of that particular Battle of Goma. It is because they saw that there is need for more engagement in Eastern DRC. He said that the M23 were not enemies but adversaries, and that in a peacekeeping mission there are no enemies but adversaries. And you remember during that time there was a report that came out that about 800 of the M23 members lost their lives in that particular war. Of course, that has never been verified. It has never been clear on the M23 side of how many people lost their lives. What we know is that on the South African National Defence Forces side, 14 were recorded, and we saw the remains of these 14 in South Africa being airlifted from that battleground to their homes for them to be buried. But we didn't have a clear information about just how many of the M23 lost their lives. Of course, this was a battle and every side had their weapons to fight against each other. Therefore, it means that there was some kind of a death toll also on the M23 side, but that has never been clearly reported. What we know is that the South African Ministry of Defense released that tally and said that about 800 of the M23 lost their lives in this battle. But what went on from that is that the M23 took over Goma, and then later on they took over Bukavu, and they encircled the SAMI DRC members who were in Goma and Sake, and that is the reason as to why they are now repatriating from these two camps where they were operating from. Now the military chief of South Africa has come out to say that if there is a need that the South African National Defence Forces will be required yet again to go into Eastern DRC, they will do so without hesitation. These are the forces, the troops that were in Goma and Sake, of course, fully surrounded by the M23. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't move. They were having their supplies delivered to them, but they wouldn't do anything in their camps as they were encircled, fully encircled by the M23. Now, the military chief is saying that if you're required to go back again to Eastern DRC, we'll do that without hesitation. He went also further to say that they see this as a win because right now, that particular battle that happened in Eastern DRC has forced the M23 and the FARDC to go back to the table to discuss about solving the conflict in Eastern DRC. That is the action that the military chief of South African National Defence Forces says that the South African National Defence Forces, part of SAMI DRC, has achieved what it went to do in Eastern DRC, and that it doesn't see that as a failure or a loss by the South African National Defense Forces or the larger SAMI DRC in their deployment in Eastern DRC. And as we're speaking today, the 18th of June 2025, the fifth withdrawal of SAMI DRC troops is underway from Goma to Tanzania via Rwanda, involving 516 soldiers. The first three groups of 750, 759, and 755 left on the 12th, the 14th, and 16th of June 2025, bringing the total to 2,840 soldiers, including the initial group of 70 sick and injured soldiers that were in Eastern DRC. The withdrawal of the forces in Eastern DRC has been very smooth. It has not had any kind of a hiccup in Eastern DRC from the DRC side to Rwanda side, Burundi, and then all the way to Tanzania. We've seen a very smooth transition and withdrawal of the SAMI DRC, which has been lauded by the SADC members as regional cooperation. Of course, just a few months ago, the South African government was up in arms against the Rwandan government, and we could see the president of South Africa against the president of Rwanda exchanging very harsh words because of what happened earlier this year. But right now, Rwanda has been the center of the repatriation of the soldiers from Eastern DRC all the way to Tanzania, and then from Tanzania, the Tanzanian troops will go to Dar es Salaam, and the South African National Defense Forces troops and the Malawi troops will board a plane to go all the way to their respective countries. Rwanda has played this major role because most of the vehicles that we are seeing withdrawing these troops from Eastern DRC are actually Rwandan companies that have been contracted by the SAMI DRC, the SADC, to withdraw the forces and equipment from Eastern DRC all the way to their respective homes. And this has also come at a time when the UN chief Bintou Keita visited the SAMI DRC force on June 14, 2025, and reaffirmed the MONUSCO SADC cooperation for peace in Eastern DRC. She also praised the troops' efforts and announced plans to visit the SADC headquarters in Gaborone, that is MONUSCO in Eastern DRC. And remember, there are some of the South African National Defense Forces troops part of MONUSCO, part of the UN peacekeeping mission in Eastern DRC. So when we say that there will be some South African National Defense Forces troops remaining in Eastern DRC even after this first withdrawal has been completed, this will be the MONUSCO forces, the South African contributing members or troops to the MONUSCO that will still continue serving in Eastern DRC to attempt to maintain peace in Eastern DRC. The South African National Defense Forces chief also shed some light on the reason as to why the SAMI DRC could not go on with the initial plan to rehabilitate the Goma airport. He said that
we were thinking of trying to sort out the damaged Goma airport, but little did we realize that we can't just go and sort out Goma airport without the DRC being involved, because Goma is part and parcel of the territory of the DRC.
Goma airport is part of the larger DRC, and they needed that authorization from the DRC government to rehabilitate that Goma airport. What we know so far is that the DRC does not want to involve itself in any kind of development in Eastern DRC in areas that are controlled by the M23. The banking sector has been paralyzed by the DRC government, and other administrative sectors that were dependent on Kinshasa have been withdrawn from these areas that are now controlled by the M23. Therefore, it means that in one way or another, the DRC government did not want to involve itself in the withdrawal of the SAMI DRC if it meant that they will rehabilitate the Goma airport. That is the reason, as given by the General of the South African National Defense Forces, why the SAMI DRC opted to use the road from Eastern DRC all the way to Tanzania, and then from Tanzania to their respective countries. Well, I will keep you informed of the latest of what is happening in Eastern DRC. Keep it bona fide.